Okay, please go ahead, Mr. Receiver.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your patience. I'd like to call to order the Municipal Financial Recovery Advisory Committee meeting. Today is Tuesday, September 13th, 2022. We are joined here today on behalf of the Governor's Office and DCED by Mr. Andrew Sheaf, on behalf of Delaware County Council, Ms. Kelly Diaz, and on behalf of the City of Chester, Mayor Kirkland and Councilman Morgan. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And as always, joined by our Chief of Staff, Vijay Kapoor, and Executive on loan, I'll say, from DCED, Cody Deal. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
All right. Well, our first agenda item is typically to address public comment. It's been slow over the past few weeks, couple months, I'll say, and there were not any public comments. We did not receive any public comments through our formal channels. So with that, we'll jump into our next agenda item, the status of the receiver's recovery plan, an agenda item that's normally accompanied by a presentation by Mr. Kapoor. But Mr. Kapoor, would you like to defer to the presentation later in the agenda, or do you have any general updates?
I would, if we could, Mr. Receiver, and if we could just to, if Mr. Deal could just double check and make sure that we're streaming on the receiver's Facebook page. Just want to make sure about that as well, if we could. Good. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Kapoor, if there are any status updates?
No additional status updates other than the presentation that we have for today.
Okay, you would like to defer. Okay.
Yes,
All right. So in my update, I'll keep it brief as well. Just a reminder that there are several vacancies, job postings within the city. Most notably, just yesterday, the Chief Financial Officer position was posted. Again, we are using the executive search firm Affion to help us with that. The description and the link should be available through the city's website, but we will also make it available through the receiver's website and social media postings as well. So please share, and encourage all to apply. We are looking for the best and brightest financial minds. In addition to that position, there is also the HR director position and several key positions within the city that are vacant. But right now, the two at the top for me personally are the CFO and the HR director. The HR director position is posted internally, not internally, but we are not using an executive search firm for that one. So it is only available on the city's website, but we will share links to that information as well. I will defer any other updates, but before jumping into the presentation, just ask if there are any general comments from the committee, any questions of me before we jump into today's presentation. It is a lengthy one. All right, well, without further ado, we do have a presentation today on Chester's financial situation, options for recovery, and also we have to discuss bankruptcy. Mr. Kapoor, are you prepared to share your screen and give today's presentation?
I am, and let me go ahead and do that. And if I could ask Mr. Receiver, you could let me know if you see that on the screen. We did great. Well, good afternoon to the committee. Good afternoon to the members of the public who may be watching this live, and those of you who may be watching this at a later date. As the receiver indicated, what I have for you today is a presentation that looks at Chester's financial situation, its options for recovery, and also to discuss the topic of bankruptcy. Over this past couple of months and really the last year, you've heard us make several financial presentations to the committee. What is different about this one is we've been able to put together a 5-year projection that looks at the city's budget over the next 5 years. We've been able to better identify the monetary gap between what the revenues and expenses are. And we've been able to at least come up with on paper options for closing that gap. And what we'd like to do today is to share this information with the committee, also to bring to the committee the conversation about a topic that has been hinted about, but we'd also like to discuss today, which is bankruptcy. So let me move on to the next slide. What we will see today here is really the severe challenges that Chester faces now, that is immediately, as well as in the very near future. And we're going to be very clear about this. The options that we're going to raise today are difficult. Folks may consider them severe, and I wouldn't disagree with that characterization. What is also severe is the city's financial condition. And what we've been doing over the last really little over 2 years here on the receivers team is trying to better understand and quantify the financial situation, and then to also develop the options to address it. And the purpose here, right, is not only to balance the budget. I mean, that is an important thing, but it's also to ensure that vital and necessary services are provided to the residents of Chester. And just to put things in context, again, from really like a 30,000 foot view, many of us, myself included, have worked with a lot of financially distressed municipalities across Pennsylvania, across the country, worked with pension funds that are very severely distressed. But without a doubt, the situation that Chester faces is by far the worst that we've ever encountered. Whether it's the pension situation, whether it's the budget situation, it is by far an orders of magnitude greater than what we've encountered in any other place that we've worked. And the options, again, that we're going to outline over here are severe, and we didn't come to them lightly. It's taken us quite a while to develop this, and it's important, I think, for the public to know and for everyone else to know that we recognize the severity of them. And I think it'll come into focus a little bit more when we understand the severity of the city's financial condition, and also the limited options that the city faces, as well as the limited options that the receiver faces. The receiver's goal, and I know I'm speaking for him, but as a member of his team, is that we are really looking to do everything in the receiver's power to truly address the situation. To truly address Chester's financial and operational problems so that Chester gets better for real. And we're really emphasizing those two words here, for real. Chester has been under state oversight in some form for the last 27 years. And unlike other cities who have been able to exit oversight, Chester's situation has gotten worse. City of Reading recently exited Act 47 after many years. And a significant reason that we think that Chester hasn't exited or hasn't improved is that very difficult steps, and we'll acknowledge they're difficult, that should have been taken earlier haven't. And we'll show here too, COVID-19 did hurt Chester, but its problems existed prior to that. And our view is that unless we actually confront these problems in a way that everybody, that is in a transparent way, and be clear about Chester's true situation, and be clear about what needs to happen or may need to happen in order for Chester to become financially and operationally viable, we're doing a disservice unless we're actually clear about that and providing this information. So let's start here by kind of looking a little bit in the recent history and looking at Chester's general fund results going back to 2013 to 2019. All of these come from the city's audits. What you'll see on this chart is basically the revenues minus the expenses in the city's general fund over this period. And the city's general fund is really where it provides, where it pays for most of its operations: police, fire, public works, pension contributions, retiree healthcare contributions. That's the general fund. And again, 2020 is where COVID hit. And we've just got recently a draft audit for 2019 that we hope to be releasing soon. So we have this data in here. That's the most recent audit we have. But you can see here by these red bars, these are deficits. The city's been running pretty significant annual deficits since 2013. 2013 is the first date here. 2019 is where we end. This green bar here, this sort of anomaly, this thing that's sticking out, in 2017, it wasn't because the city did really well financially that year. The reason why this bar is green and a positive 7.7 million was because the city did a borrowing of around $12 million. So think of this almost like a cash advance. that the city did in 2017, and also received a $2 million emergency loan from DCED in 2017 because the city was running out of money. But in these other years, so in reality, if the city didn't do that, you'd be seeing a similar deficit like you do in the other years. And these numbers are between $6 million to $8.6 million, starting with $2.2 million in 2013 deficit. And in 2019, again, the most recent audited numbers that we have, it's around $6.8 million deficit. But the issue here is this looks bad, and this would look bad for any city, but particularly for the city of Chester, because the city was also not making its required annual pension payments from 2014 to 2019 either. So those of you who may be watching these MFRACs from before will know that each year the city is required to make an annual payment to its pension funds. It's referred to as a minimum municipal obligation, or an MMO. The city did not make those full payments, or at least the payments that were on paper, between 2014 and 2020. In 2021, and so what was happening, as you can see from this chart, was the MMO, or the bill, if you will, was the blue bar, and the green bar is what the city actually contributed. You'll see in 2014 and 2015, there's significant gaps between what was owed and what was actually paid. And so in 2021, we were able to make the MMO that was on paper, made that payment of $10.8 million. But what has happened is over this time period, we still owe that money, and interest has also accrued on it. So as of the end of 2021, all the back due payments and the interest payments all total around $39.8 million. So that's almost $40 million. But again, that was as of December 31st, 2021. Today is September 13th, 2022. Interest has also been accruing on those payments. And so what you're seeing there is it's probably even higher than it is right now. And you're going to hear me use the term pension receivables pretty often in this presentation. And I want to make sure everybody at least kind of understands what that is, because when we talk about pensions, sometimes, people will hear the term unfunded liability, and, not all pensions are funded at 100%, and that's true. But the receivables are different than what's considered an unfunded liability. And so what I'd like to do is kind of use an example to try and kind of drive this point home. So let's assume that you have $100,000 remaining on a mortgage in your mortgage payment for your home, and your monthly mortgage payment is $1,000 a month. So in this example, a pension plan's unfunded liability is that amount that's remaining on your mortgage, that $100,000. Think of it in terms of that term. That's the unfunded liability. So if you hear a pension plan is 50% funded or 70% funded, that amount that's still outstanding and not fully funded, that's your overall mortgage that you still owe. But the receivable is your annual monthly mortgage payment, the bill you get every month that you got to make the payment to the bank. And if you don't make your monthly mortgage payment, just like you don't make your monthly pension payment, what happens is you got to pay penalties and interest. And so that approximately $39.8 million in receivables is like a missed mortgage payment, except instead of missing the payment to your mortgage lender or the bank, you're missing it to the pension fund. So if we include that amount and include those amounts that were missed over the years, you'll see that the city of Chester's general fund results are even worse. And for a city whose annual general fund is around $55 million, this is over 10%. In many of these years was over 10%, closer to 15% of your general fund revenues or expenses, which is terrifying from a financial perspective. In 2019, again, the most recent that we have, it was around 11.6 million. But if you look at these numbers, I mean, most of these, again, putting aside what happened in 2017, which again we've said was a quirk of doing a borrowing that the city is continuing to pay off today, and the DCED loan, the emergency loan, we're looking at deficits the city's running on an annual basis around $12 million. And that's significant on a $60 million or $55 million general fund budget. So you may be asking the question, you saw a lot of red bars, why hasn't Chester run out of money yet? If things are as bad as I listed. And there's a couple of reasons for why that is. The first reason is the city wasn't paying its MMOs. So it's pension payments, and that's reflected in the pension fund. Right now, as of the most recent police pension account statement, the police pension fund has the equivalent of around 8 months of benefit payments left in it. That's how much it has, which again is terrifying for anyone who's a retiree or who is in a pension plan. It's extremely low. And of course, what was happening over that time period was the city was essentially not putting in money into the pension plan, but instead funding operations and not making the kind of reductions that needed to be reduced over that time period. And the pension plan was being shorted from that. The second reason that Chester hasn't run out of money yet was assistance for the Commonwealth. In 2017, again, I mentioned there was a $2 million emergency loan that when the city was on the brink of running out of cash. There have been other grants the Commonwealth has given. Most recently, and occurring last year, and hopefully also occurring this year, is the Commonwealth has also given a $5 million no interest loan. Again, this is from DCED. So thank you, Mr. Sheaf, that helped the city avoid running out of cash. And what essentially happens here is by the end of the year, because the city receives most of its revenues in the middle of the year from property taxes or earlier in the year, it has got to basically live off of those revenues to pay its expenses that are ongoing, like payroll and other things. And by the end of the year, what cities like Chester sometimes have to do is to borrow money called a TRAN, tax revenue anticipation note, so that they can get money in order to essentially to pay their bills in the early part of the year until that money comes in from the property taxes. And so DCED, because many lenders are not going to lend to a city a city like in Chester's financial situation, DCEDs had to step in. And it's not just money that DCED just has kind of lying around. This money is actually earmarked for other Act 47 cities. So what's happening is Chester is getting that loan. As the city pays it back, that money is then going to other Act 47 communities for their needs and for grants and other things that DCED does for other cities. So it is pretty important to pay that back. And the final area that we'll talk about in a moment is the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA funds. This is the federal stimulus dollars that were passed to help cities deal with COVID. So those are important. We'll talk about those in a moment, and again, we'll have a better sense of where Chester's financial situation is, and then we'll get a little bit more into the options for closing the gap. But in terms of what we need to do and how the receivers team is looking at this, and how we think those of you who are watching this also should look at this, is that in order for Chester to be financially solvent, that is really being financially fixed, and this is really at a minimum level here, its annual revenues have to cover its annual expenses. Otherwise, the city is going to run out of one-time money to pay recurring costs. And basically this means is you've got to be able to pay your bills with the money that's coming in. If you do a one-time funding, such as for monetization, which is critical, and I should say this, I'm not trying to minimize it. That has to happen for Chester, and we'll get into that in a moment. But they only help this particular situation if those one-time revenues can reduce the city's annual expenses. Now, that could happen if we make payments to the pension funds through a combination of cuts and money going in. What that could do is that could reduce the city's annual pension payments, those annual MMO payments. And if we do that, then that helps with the situation of recurring revenues covering recurring costs. But what it means is, and I think this is really important for people to look at this, so they don't say, okay, if all we have to do is the water monetization will be fixed. The answer is no, that's not true. We need it. We absolutely need it. And I'll get to that in a moment. But just monetizing the water system is necessary. It's necessary, but it's insufficient to make Chester financially solvent. We really have to have recurring revenues be able to cover recurring costs. And the situation of why that has to happen is that if you don't have a situation like that, you'll eventually run out of money, even if you have a large sum of money. So let's take another example. Let's say you inherit $50,000 from a relative, but each year you spend $10,000 more than you earn. But instead of cutting costs, you say, all right, great, I just got this inheritance. I'm not gonna cut my costs. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take $10,000 from that $50,000 each year, and I'm gonna spend it. I'm gonna keep it in my budget. So what happens is after 5 years, you'll have spent your entire inheritance, but you will not have the money to pay for all your spending. You will still have that gap. And the same idea applies to a city. If Chester or any other city gets a large lump sum payment, uses it to plug annual operating deficits, eventually it's going to run out of money. And what'll happen is it'll still have that massive deficit. It won't have that money anymore. And it really is kind of a kick the can approach. And it happened, I would submit to you, it actually already happened here in Chester. In 2017, again, we talked about the city borrowed about $12 million to pay its general fund expenses. It got the $2 million loan, emergency loan from DCED. So that's like getting a $14 million windfall, right? That's like getting it, but it didn't reduce its expenses to an affordable level. And as a result of that, where we are today is we have to pay off these loans. We're paying around $3.6 million a year to pay those loans back. But the city is still in a fiscal crisis. And so, that's the problem of saying, okay, we'll just take a lump sum and forget about it. It really becomes a kick the can approach. And that's not something we're interested in doing for Chester. Again, Chester's been in state oversight for 27 years. It really has run out of time for ideas like that. So let me move now into the baseline 5-year projection. And in order for us, so now what we're doing is that's the past. We've looked a little bit of the past here. I now want to start talking about kind of looking out into the future over the next 5 years. And in order to do that, to create a starting point, what we develop is something that's referred to as a 5-year baseline projection. And what that does is that shows kind of revenues and expenses, projected revenues and expenses over the next 5 years. And it assumes something that's referred to as a status quo situation, which basically means there's no significant changes to revenues, such as tax or fee increases or decreases, or any major changes to expenses like layoffs. So I want you all to think of a baseline projection as if the city's revenues and expenses were basically on autopilot. Just kind of go out and let's see what happens with revenues and expenses. And what it allows us to do by using this type of baseline projection is it shows us what the gap is, not just for next year, but also going forward. And it helps us to kind of, figure out what we need to do in terms of quantification to come up with possible solutions to close that gap. And the baseline projection, I'll say, is this is something that is kind of ongoing. Our financial team, public financial management, reviews the city's actual revenues and expenditure data in order to confirm what the growth assumptions that are being used in the baseline. And they may change. If we see stronger than expected revenue growth in some areas, we'll change those assumptions. If we see weaker or there's risk, we'll change it the other way. But it is just like in any projection, you can't be 100% certain. You do your best with the information and the data you have. That's what the baseline projection is. And so some of the major assumptions of this baseline projection is that the city real estate tax remains where it is, 9.4041 mils. The resident earned income tax remains where it is. The commuter earned income tax remains where it is. There's no change in casino or incinerator revenue sharing arrangements. The headcount remains the same, including police and fire, so there's no layoffs. We've assumed a salary increase of 3% year over year. We've assumed healthcare insurance costs will rise between 5% and 20% per year, that there's no new debt, no new programs, no new positions, other than the chief financial officer, which is currently in an interim role through a third party, would come back in-house. And that we also assume $3 million a year for capital projects that the city needs to spend. What is not in the baseline is that some of you may know that the Chester Upland School District is moving forward with trying to implement or have a referendum to implement an earned income tax. And under the law, if a municipality has an earned income tax, the school district that is part of that municipality can petition to receive half of 1% of that earned income tax for themselves. So right now, the city of Chester has an earned income tax that is the second highest in the Commonwealth, by the way. The Chester Upland School District does not have an earned income tax, does not get any of the money that the city has, but is moving forward, as I said, to try and do that. If they're successful in doing so, which would occur next year, that would result in lost annual revenues to the city of Chester of between $1.5 and $1.7 million. The other thing that's not in the baseline is health insurance premium growth. If the cost growth grows faster than what we projected, then that again will be an impact on the baseline. And even this year, the city is on pace to spend about $1.5 million more than what was budgeted in 2022 for health insurance costs. So that's again why you saw that on the prior slide, we're looking at between 5% and 20%, because again, we have to go off of what's happening with the city. What's also not in the baseline is potential costs associated with ALS ambulance services. If Crozier Hospital ceases to provide those and it needs to fall on the city, that's something that again we don't have factored in here. And the final thing that we don't have factored in here is the costs of any large emergency repairs to city-owned buildings or vehicles, which are in very, very poor condition. All of our buildings are in bad condition. In particular, the building that houses the city's public works department. All of those need to be fixed. All of those need to be upgraded. But any large emergency repairs is simply not in the baseline. And the other thing that's not in the baseline that I want to caveat here is, as part of our analysis and part of what we've observed here in Chester, is that there need to be investments made into the active employee workforce in terms of their salaries in particular, and that costs money, obviously. And so in our baseline budget, we don't have any additional dollars in there for additional cash compensation. But we recognize that in order for the city to be able to retain and recruit individuals to provide the vital and necessary services that residents expect, that we do need to invest in that. But that is not necessarily in the baseline. And it's also true not only investing in its workforce and its personnel, but also in its infrastructure, its roads, its bridges, its facilities, its equipment, large equipment. They're in very poor condition. And we have not yet calculated the maximum amount that the city needs to be able to invest, to be able to get that up to an area that we think is appropriate. And so those things are also, I think, important to know that are missing from the baseline. So let's get to it. Let's actually get to the baseline projection that we have here on slide 17. And this is the 5-year projection from 2023 to 2027 in millions. The current baseline projection shows a $46.5 million deficit in 2023. Now that includes the $39.8 million for the past due pension contributions, the receivables. But even without that, And again, we think that has to be included. That needs to be included in here. That's been another can that's been kicked down the road. But even without that, if we excluded it, the city still would have a projected $6.7 million deficit. And that's around 10% of the city's general fund. That is for next year's budget. That is for the budget that we are looking to try and put together right now to fund the city next year. And then what you see in 2024 is the deficit is smaller. It goes down to 3.6 million. And again, all of this is assuming that we've made that pension contribution in 2023. But in 2024, it goes down to $3.6 million. But the reason it goes down is because we project that we're going to be able to use more of the ARPA funding, more of the federal stimulus dollar funding for operations. But when ARPA expires at the end of 2024, ARPA will go away. And there's also a firefighter grant, a SAFER grant that funds 8 firefighters. When that goes away, basically at the end of 2024, the deficits jump back to the $12.4 million that we see in 2025. And 2025, 12.4 million. And then they continue to grow in the out years. And again, you all recall, like, these numbers are not too dissimilar to what we saw in the previous slides, where, back in 2014 to 2019. So this is the baseline projection: 46.5 million in 2023, negative 46.5, negative 3.6, and negative 12.4. So why again is this so high? One is we've got to make the receivable pension payments. The other reason is the annual pension payment, which is assumed to be in the plan. That this annual pension payment, the annual MMO, assumes that the receivables are already in the plan, but they're not. We all know that they're not. Next year, the pension contributions, the total pension contributions with the receivables plus the annual payment will total approximately $53.9 million. And again, in a moment, you'll see how that relates to the rest of the budget and how much of that would take it. And again, for those who are saying, oh, well, that's most of that is the receivable, you're right, but we still have a $6.7 million deficit, even if you were to exclude those, which again is over 10%, and that's a very hard gap to close. So let's put that 2023 deficit in context. The projected operating budget for 2023, so everything in it for operating, is approximately $61.2 million. That includes $14.1 million for the annual pension MMO. Now, if we add that $39.8 million in receivables, that results in a pension contribution. If we add that to the MMO, the scheduled MMO payment, again, this just gets us to be current, we'd have to pay almost $54 million, $53.9 million. And that's about 88% of the city's entire 2023 general fund. And so essentially, I mean, just again, to put this in context, in order for us to fund the pension contributions and the debt repayments in 2023 for the money that the city borrowed in 2017, the city would need to eliminate every service it provides and every city employee for a year. And it would still need to cut retiree health care for all active and retired employees for that year in order to make that work without some significant revenue coming in. It is just that big. And you can see it here if graphics are a little bit easier to understand. This is the 2023 budget right here. This is the $61.2 million. Health insurance, mayor and solicitor, police, all the different departments we have. This large black piece here is the base pension. That's the MMO. That's the $14.1 million. And this is the receivables, the $39.8 million. And so I don't have like graphic motions over here, but you can in your mind think about kind of moving this piece over here. And basically what would happen is you'd only have a little bit left in the entire budget because so much of that money, if you were to look to pay from the operating revenues, would be taken up by pensions. It's just that big. And so we cannot close this gap in 2023, this gap here, just by cutting costs. It's basically impossible to do. I basically said to you that we would have to shut the city down for a year is what we'd have to do, and use all those revenues to pay for pensions just to get current. That is just to get current. That is not to fix the pension problem. That is literally just to get current. And so how we close this gap in 2023 is that we need a large influx of money. We just absolutely do. And this is what I was talking about earlier about the monetization from the water system. Like we that has to come in. Otherwise, the city is not going to be able to do it. We recognize, and we need to recognize and be upfront that any monetization, whether it's done via a private company or stays in public hands, that's eventually going to lead to higher rates for residents and property owners, and that eventually is going to be in their bills. And so again, we need to be clear about that. That will have an impact on residents. That will have an impact on property owners. But again, as we kind of go back to it, even with this large influx of money, we still have about a $6.7 million deficit. And again, remember what I said earlier, recurring revenues need to equal recurring costs. That clearly doesn't happen with a $6.7 million deficit. And so monetization, as we're describing it, it's a necessary, but alone, it's insufficient in Chester's recovery. So another thing that we want to look at in the baseline, let's just go back really quick. We see the big gap here in 2023, but also we see a very large gap here in 2025, which if it weren't for this significant bar here would look much worse. And the reason why we see that other large gap in 2025 is because the rescue plan dollars, the ARPA dollars that the city has been relying on, which really has saved Chester from running out of money, goes away. So the city received around $30.4 million in ARPA funding. And what the city is allowed to do under the law is that they're able to use some of this money. They're also able to use some of this money to pay for positions which were eliminated during the pandemic. It also allows, so we can basically just fund some of those positions, as are referred to as return to work, that I'll talk about in a moment. It also allows the city to spend a certain amount of money for general operations. And you do this using a calculation that's referred to as a revenue replacement calculation. It's kind of a little bit of a complicated calculation. I'm not going to get into it in great detail here, other than to say you look at the 2019 revenues, and then you look at the revenues in the respective year, you apply some type of growth factor, and you see what the difference is. And you can use that difference in ARPA funds basically for any city operations that you want to. Now, the federal guidelines right now under the law, the city cannot use ARPA money for return to work or revenue replacement after 2024. So what you'll see is what's happening is there is about $7.1 million in ARPA funding in 2024. What happens is that goes away in 2025. It goes to zero. So what happens is it's like losing $7.1 million. That's in revenue. That's basically what's happening there. And that's why you see that large gap in 2025. And there's also again, as I mentioned earlier too, there's a federal grant to fund 8 firefighters, the SAFER grant that expires in 2024. Now, in our baseline, we assume those 8 firefighters who are funded by the SAFER grant stay on. But the revenue goes away. And again, that's another contributor to the big gap in 2025. And so folks understand this and also kind of understand the question about like, okay, so you got $30.4 million. Why aren't you fine? We are actually using as much ARPA revenue as we legally can through 2024 to go towards the city's operations. What's happened in 2021, we relied on 2.6. In 2022, relying on $3 million. In 2023, the estimate that we are relying on is only 1.2 million. And that comes from stronger than expected earned income tax revenues that we're seeing in 2022. We've accounted for those in the baseline, by the way, too, in case folks are wondering, did you make that change? We did, but what happens is because the revenue loss becomes smaller because of the stronger earned income tax revenues, we're not able to use as much revenue replacement in 2023. So it's kind of a good problem to have. But what happens is in 2024, and again, we're looking at revenue replacement over here, based on the 2023 projection, based on what we think we're going to get in revenues in 2023, we're going to be relying on around 6.1 million in revenue replacement. And the remaining amount, you saw me use 7.1 in the prior chart, that's return to work funding that I'll get to on the next slide. But again, just like in our projections, as revenue data comes into the city, that 2023 or 2024 estimates, they may change based on that data. So we may be able to use more in revenue replacement, or we might have to use less in revenue replacement. So the other reliance on ARPA, not only is the revenue replacement dollars, which are going straight into funding the city's operations, but also something that's referred to as return to work. And return to work allows you to do is basically pay for positions that were eliminated during COVID. And so what this has allowed the city to do is bring back or fund a fair number of positions. 5 public works laborers, which is a pretty big number. 1 clerk typist, 1 admin assistant, the workforce development coordinator, the community health education coordinator, a COVID specialist, the building health monitor, half the salary of a city accountant, and the supervisor of inspector position. But again, after 2025 or in 2025, after 2024, we don't have, the ARPA funding goes away. We're not able to use return to work. And what happens for these positions is, at least in the baseline, they're continued, but there's no funding for it. And that again is part of the reason why you see that big gap in 2025. So, that is the baseline. That is kind of like the current, or excuse me, the projected 5 years if we are on autopilot. The next part of the presentation I want to get to is options for closing the gap. So, we've seen this gap here, here on slide 17. We'll see again. The question is, how do we close this gap? And again, these are very, very big numbers. This is not something, and we acknowledge that. This is why it's taken us as long as it has to be able to come publicly with the situation that we see, because this is not something where you can tweak a number here or tweak a number there and it closes the gap. So to close deficits this big, we have to consider extremely difficult actions. And the only options here in terms of what we've been able to see that have the kind of magnitude to be able to close these gaps here. And we're really not just looking, as I said before, in 2023, this isn't just the receivables. We're assuming that's going to be taken care of by monetization. I realize that may be a pretty big assumption to make, but if we don't assume that, then we might as well just stop this presentation and give up. We're not going to be able to say, we're not going to be able to reduce that from cutting operations. But the only options that would come close to doing this are eliminating retiree health care for all current and future retirees, to cap the city's costs for active employee health care, essentially by requiring active employees to pay more or to reduce the cost to a plan, to a lower plan, is to reduce the annual city pension costs through a combination of revenues from monetization, as well as pension cuts to current and future retirees, and eliminating or substantially reducing city debt service. And I want to be clear here, we are open to other ideas. We're not saying this is take it or leave it. These are options that we've come up with that, again, on paper, close the very severe gap. But in order for us to have these kind of conversations, and in order, I think, to discuss this in a realistic way, whatever those other options are, those other ideas are, which again, we welcome, they've got to close these deficits, and they have to result in recurring revenues covering recurring expenses. That absolutely has to happen. So again, this is slide 27. You've seen this before. This is the baseline projection. What we're going to do now is kind of take you through the savings of each one of those options that I outlined. And then at the end of this section, we put it all together so you can see how it closes the gap and what impact is made. So the first thing we're looking at is eliminating retiree healthcare for all current and future retirees. Right now, the city of Chester is self-insured for active and retiree healthcare, meaning what happens is the city pays the actual costs of the healthcare incurred. So what you have down here is we've got some of the various plans that retirees are on. And last year, the city did move a significant number of retirees to a Medicare supplemental plan. That pays first, and that allows the city is then responsible for essentially it's responsible for the costs that are not covered by that plan. But we have a lot of retirees, and the plans that most of the retirees are on, the Select POS and the Select EPO. Select POS is where most of the police retirees are on. The Select EPO is mostly firefighter retirees. They're very rich plans in the sense of very costly to the city, not a lot of costs to the retirees. And what you have on slide 29 is the various plans that are offered to the city. The Select POS and the Select EPO plan, neither of them have any deductible. It's zero deductible. There's a low out-of-pocket maximum, $500 single, $1,000 all else. For primary care or specialist visits, it's only a $5 copay. And then really significantly here, when we look at the prescription coverage, retirees are either only paying $1 for generic or $3 for preferred or specialty drugs. So it's either $1 or $3. So many of you, I think, who may not be in the public sector have plans, know the copays there are a lot higher than this. And obviously retirees who tend to use medical treatment more, whether that's in prescription coverage, hospitalization, or just general doctor visits, that's very costly to the very costly to the city. And so one way of kind of like figuring out and putting some kind of numbers around how costly these plans are is actuaries can create what's referred to as premium equivalents. So even for a plan that is self-insured, what they essentially say is we're going to develop a premium, which is the amount that it would probably cost an individual to buy a plan like this in the general marketplace. Now, there are very few plans that look like this that are even offered these days. So even if you wanted one and wanted to pay for it, you probably wouldn't be able to. But in terms of creating that premium equivalent, it's different for different tiers. So these plans are pretty similar in terms of their costs, which are very costly. Go down to employee and spouse. For the Select EPO plan, it's about $34,000 a year in premium equivalents. The Select POS plan, again, where most of the police retirees are in, it's around $34,000 for employee and spouse, so two-person. If you got an employee and family, that's even higher. Now, Chester's median household income, the city of Chester, for a household in Chester in 2022, the median household income in Chester was almost $33,000. The employee and spouse coverage, the premium equivalent for these healthcare plans, are greater than the entire median household income for a Chester household. So, by themselves, these are very rich plans, but when you also compare it to a city like Chester, whose population is has weaker economic demographics, it's very hard for a city like that and for a tax base like that to be able to afford benefits as costly as this. So when we look at the estimated savings, so if we say, all right, if you eliminate retiree healthcare, and that is not just the plans, but also the Medicare supplemental benefit as well, and you don't have any retiree healthcare benefits. That saves, starting in 2023, that saves about $6 million starting in 2023, and that savings grows to about $8.2 million in 2027. So that's retiree healthcare. The next place we want to look is active employee healthcare. Again, we're looking at things that are going to close the gap. And like the retirees, active employees also have a very costly healthcare plan. There's two healthcare plans that are offered to active employees. One is referred to as the base plan. The other is referred to as a buy-up plan. In a moment, we'll look at what those are. But just so folks know, all but one active employee in the city right now is in the buy-up plan. Under the current situation we have in the city, we'll talk about this in a moment, but union employees are not paying what's referred to as the difference in the caps. But right now, most of these employees are in the buy-up plan, which requires, at least for non-represented employees, an employee contribution. And so that EPO buy-up plan, so I'm going to talk about the buy-up plan. This again is where most of the active city employees are right now. Doesn't have a deductible, $15 copay for primary care visits, $30 copay for specialist visits, and then in the prescription, it's $5, $10, $25 for retail prescription drug copays, and double that for mail order. You'll see in the EPO base plan, there is a deductible. There's a $1,500, $3,000 deductible. The copays are higher, and there's also coinsurance here. Those, and what I'll also say here too is the prescription drug coverage is also higher in the EPO base plan. And so right now, under the amended recovery plan, right now the city is operating under what's referred to as an amended recovery plan, which was proposed by the receiver and which was adopted by the Commonwealth Court. The amended recovery plan sets caps on the amount that the city needs to pay for healthcare costs, including vision and dental. And so the way it works right now, at least for non-represented employees, where this concept works, is that any costs over that cap have to be paid by the employee as an employee contribution. But to date, these have not been applied to union employees because they have not agreed to them in their collective bargaining agreements. They have been applied to non-represented employees. And these are where the healthcare caps are. And in 2022, for an employee and family, it's $35,112, which is high, which is also, as maybe we saw earlier, higher than the median household income we see for a Chester household. And then year over year, we increase those caps by about 5%. But again, all the non-represented employees are under this structure, but none of the unionized employees. So no Teamster, no IAFF member, and no FOP member, which are the majority of the city's employees. And so if we apply the caps starting in 2023, we say, look, we're going to apply these caps, and the employees are responsible for whatever is over. Medical, it would save money in medical and prescription. It would also save money in dental and vision. The total cap savings in 2023 would start off at about $1 million, and then would grow annually to about $2 million in 2027. Now, we've talked about retiree healthcare. We've talked about active employee healthcare. Now I want to talk about pensions. And here we need to reduce the annual city pension payments. And that's got to be done through a combination of one-time revenues from monetization, and it also has to be done by reductions to pensions, including for people who are already receiving pensions. As I said earlier, the police pension fund for the city of Chester, as of August 31st, 2022, has assets that are equivalent to approximately 8 months of pension payments. That is it. It's about $4.6 million. On average, that plan pays out about $550,000 a month. Again, that's the equivalent. It's the equivalent of about 8 months of pension payments. which is, again, I don't think there's any other plan in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that is as poorly funded or is as at risk as the city of Chester's police pension plan. And in order to fix this issue, to address this issue, it's going to require both a significant cash infusion into the plans, as well as cuts to the existing pensions so that the costs drop to a level that the city can actually afford and that stabilize. Because the last thing we want to do here is go through this process, make a lot of very painful changes, and then watch the pension costs start to increase and go up and up and up. We have got to find a way of reducing the costs and keeping them at an affordable level. And again, the only way we do that is through monetization and through pension reductions. And again, from a monetization perspective, the only asset the city has that can come close to the amount of money that the city needs is the water system. And again, I will reiterate this point that has not changed from the receiver's perspective. And he said many times that, again, monetization has to occur, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the system needs to be privatized. If we're able to get the kind of money that will address the pension issue as well as the city's capital issues, then there's no concern here. There's no the city's we would be fine, or the receiver's team would be fine with keeping the water system in public hands. Now, there's a little bit of a quirk here when we talk about about depositing a large amount of money into the city's pension funds that would essentially allow them not to be distressed anymore. And that is on the amount of money that the city actually brings in from the distressed pension earned income tax. And this is a creature of state law. This is what state law is. If state law changes, this is a different story. But as this exists right now, because the city's pension plans are so poorly funded, Chester has the power and does levy what's referred to as a distressed pension earned income tax. And that's levied on both residents and commuters. And it essentially allows the city to collect more in taxes that have to go to the pension plans. But if the plans are no longer fiscally distressed, if they're no longer financially distressed, again, say that we get a monetization, we do the combination of the benefit cuts and the monetization, the city's going to lose that ability to levy that tax because the plans won't be distressed anymore. And so you lose that power. Now, it would be good for residents and commuters because they wouldn't have to pay the tax. But from the city's perspective, you lose revenues as well. And so in order for us to kind of understand this and to account for it in the baseline, we also have to account for the loss of the distressed pension earned income tax in the analysis. And so we'll get to that in a moment. But what that means is just because we're reducing the MMO to a low number doesn't mean all of that comes in terms of savings, because if a lot of that is being offset by money we're also losing from having to reduce the distressed pension EIT. So a couple of things I just want to put, as we did with retiree healthcare, I want to put a couple of things in the context here when looking at pensions. One is for police and fire, both of those pensions, the benefits that they receive are higher than what the law requires. The city is under the third class city code, and the pension, which a minimum pension benefit structure is laid out in the third class city code. What Chester retirees and most active employees, except for those hired after 2017 in police and fire, receive a benefit that is higher than what is the minimum under the third class city code. Those hired after February of 2017 have the minimum under the third class city code. So firefighters, police officers hired after that time, they are kind of under the minimum under the third class city code. And by the way, those individuals also do not have retiree healthcare. They do not have the retiree healthcare benefit. But you can see here in terms of, and this is just police officer, although there's another one for fire, these are the benefits here for the pensions. The final average salary, you may have seen earlier this year, the question of last 12 months versus last 3 years. But for many of the retirees, prior to the recalculations that were done, they were receiving their last 12 months. The final average salary compensation, this is a very, very big one, which also allows for pension spiking. The pre-February 1st, 2017 hires have a pension that allows all W-2 earnings to be included in that calculation. So it's 50% of that. Whereas those hired after February 1st, it's just their base pay and longevity pay. So if you work a lot of overtime prior to this in your last 12 months, which is referred to as a pension spike, you could get a very, very large pension on your way out, which obviously impacts the pension fund. There's other things here as well, a drop, employee contribution, the service credit, et cetera. But in terms of this, the point we're making here is the current pension benefits for many of the existing police and fire are higher than what the minimum is under the third-class city code. And what's happened is over the years, we've seen significant increases in the pension liabilities. So in 2019, the liabilities there are around 131 million. This is the unfunded liability. And in the 2021 valuation, we saw that significantly increased to about $155 million. The other thing that's been happening over here in terms of the costs that we also have to get our arms around is that over the years, pension benefits were enhanced. During some of those years, the city, whether it was through agreement or through arbitration, agreed with the union to enhance the benefits, which is again maddening if you look at it from our current perspective, where we're trying to address this. And back in February of this year, we did a presentation that you can go back to and look either on Facebook or also on the receiver's website that showed pension benefit enhancements that contributed to these costs. And we laid out a history of going back to, I think, 1978 of how these pensions how they changed. And there were enhancements. And in the city, unfortunately, history shows that while it appeared to be on the course to start to contain these pension costs, really around 2003 to 2005, these pension benefit increases undid all that. And so now, again, we find ourselves in this current situation. If everyone's asking, well, why are we here? Why is it taking so long? Like, why are you listing such severe things? The fact of the matter is, if some of these things were addressed when they needed to be addressed, or weren't enhanced, at least weren't made worse, we wouldn't be proposing, or wouldn't have to be proposing what we're proposing or showing as options right now. And again, you all can go back and look at this. You can contact us. We'll be happy to send you the detailed PowerPoint from that area. The reforms were eliminated in a 2003 to 2005 MOU after making changes in the 1987 to 89 collective bargaining agreement. And then in 2009, it also appears to us that the City Pension Board improperly enhanced the benefit for certain police officers by changing the final average salary from the last 3 years to the last 12 months, which again allowed pension spiking. And if you go back to that presentation and go watch that, we have we go into great detail about that. And if you're interested in this area, want to know a little bit more about the history, seeing that February 15th presentation, I think is worth your time. So in terms of like, okay, what does this actually do? How much does this actually save? When we look at it, we've got the MMO savings, and we've estimated these amounts here, but we also show what happens when we eliminate the distressed EIT. So this is the pension. You'll see it offsets some of it. So in 2023, again, we're assuming we have a monetization that is more than this amount, but it is at least this amount. But you'll see the savings here, even though the MMO goes down by about 12 million each year, the overall savings is really less here year over year. A lot of that, again, has to do with the has to do with the distressed pension EIT. So the final area I want to discuss and mention is eliminating or significantly reducing debt service. Debt service, as I talked about earlier, these are the loans, these are the bonds the city has. Unlike Detroit, who some of you may be familiar with, who was in bankruptcy, a great deal of Detroit's bankruptcy had to do with bad debt and a very, very large debt that they entered into. Chester does not have. That's not Chester's situation. Chester has some that, again, we'll talk about in a second, but Chester's main problem is retiree benefit liabilities. It's retiree health and its pensions and its recurring revenues, a tax base that really can't cover those costs. But the city has issued debt to support the community college back in 2010, and then issued debt in 2017, partially to cover its operating expenses. This, again, if you remember from the prior slides, that green bar, this is what we're talking about here. That's not how debt should be used, by the way. Debt should be used for one-time expenses, things like capital needs. It should not be used to pay for ongoing operations. And so each year what the city has to do, though, is it has to make a payment to pay back those borrowings. That's referred to as a debt service payment. And the main debt that the city has, again, it's not a lot of overall, but it's still a significant amount, I think, relative to what we need to address in closing the gap. But you have the Series 2017 A bonds. These are the 12 million in bonds that I talked about to pay the general fund liabilities and to create required reserve funds, which again are gone now. The 2017 B bonds, that refinanced debt that was originally issued by CETA. The 2010 bonds, this is for the Delaware County Community College, and the 2019 bonds, which is the city's portion of the debt that Delaware County issued as part of its overall financing to build Subaru Park here in Chester. And the county refinanced those bonds in 2019. So pursuant to a contribution agreement, the city pays 25% of the annual debt service for the 2019 bonds. So if we eliminate or significantly reduce the city's debt service, the city would save around $3.7 million a year in the debt service. So just kind of putting it together here, as we kind of lay it all together, the following table applies that impact of the options against the baseline. Remember, we saw earlier here, this first line is the baseline, and we're trying to put it all together. Again, assuming monetizations that fully eliminate the unfunded liabilities, not just the receivables. That's what this assumes. You'll see how all of this is put together and what the net result is at the bottom. In 2023, this would result in kind of a net surplus of around $3.7 million. But you'll see by the time we get to 2027, it kind of barely closes the gap. We're at around $1 million surplus, which is extremely low. This is not where you want to be. This is basically sort of bare bones. In 2024, the other thing that's done over here, which is critical for the city, is one, we set aside $6 million for a cash flow reserve because we're not going to expect DCED to be able to continue to fund the city's TRAN year over year. So this, and we don't expect any third party to be really willing to loan the city money given its financial condition or at a rate that is that makes sense for the city. So creating a cash flow reserve of around $6 million and then additional capital for city facilities. Again, I mentioned some of the issues we're having with our buildings. This money has to be, this again is just the minimum, and this isn't even the overall amount. And again, we're assuming here monetization and pension reductions that fully eliminate the unfunded liabilities. So again, what it does not include, additional money for investment for active employees, economic development impacts, the money necessary to fully address the city's capital needs, enough money to actually set aside a general fund reserve, a real general fund reserve, not just a cash reserve, but a general fund reserve that the Government Finance Officers Association recommends at a minimum to be at least 16% of general fund expenses. But for a city like Chester, it really should be more. It really should be closer to 20, 25%, maybe even 30%, given the city's economic condition. And again, I want everybody to remember the caveats on the baseline that I mentioned back on slide 16 about the need to invest in city operations and in capital needs. And so the final section here, in terms of what comes next, is talking about what are the real options that the receiver has here. And again, we're being very direct and very blunt with everybody here, very transparent about what we're seeing and what we've been working through over the last 2+ years. The fact of the matter is, the receiver truthfully has very few options. He can only take action that the law allows him to take. He's not an elected official. He is not a state legislator. He doesn't have the power to sort of wave a wand and change certain things. He can only do what the law allows him to take. And outside of an agreement by the various groups here, or other groups, or other people who can help, to agree to try and close these changes or other changes that would close the gap, the only real other option the receiver has is to file a Chapter 9 bankruptcy, is to have the city file a Chapter 9 bankruptcy. And in terms of what that means for Chester, because we'll get a lot of questions about that, and I know folks would have a lot of questions about what that means, and so let me answer it as sort of simply as I can from a high level area. Is what bankruptcy would mean for Chester is that it would provide Chester with the ability to try to reduce its pension and retiree healthcare costs, which it has to do to have any chance of being fiscally solvent. That is the only way that works. The other thing that it would allow Chester to do is the opportunity to negotiate with other creditors so that the city can have a fresh start, which it desperately needs. It absolutely needs that. As you saw from the previous slides, the city has basically in years past sort of getting by year over year, really by kicking bills in from one year into the next year. That's not a way that is going to be that's not what a fiscally solvent city looks like. Now, in terms of what this would mean for residents is, unlike a company which may declare bankruptcy and could close its doors and go away, that doesn't happen with cities, doesn't happen with municipalities. Chester would continue to provide services to its residents. But again, we want to be clear here that we would expect some employees would choose to leave city employment because of the uncertainty of bankruptcy. We understand that. We would also expect that the city would have difficulty filling vacancies due to that same uncertainty. Now, one thing I will say to city employees, to some city employees who may be looking at this and saying, all right, I'm out. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if the city declares bankruptcy here, or the receiver goes to bankruptcy, and we're looking at pension and retiree healthcare, you're not protected by leaving city employment. What happens is, through a bankruptcy process, retiree healthcare and pensions could be adjusted, could be changed. And so thinking that, okay, if I just leave and go out, I'll be protected, I'll escape it, is not the case. Because again, as you've seen here, in order to be able to close the gap, under the current situation, it's requiring a significant reduction in retiree healthcare and changes to pensions as well. So with that, and this is, I promise, my last slide here before I turn it back over to the committee to ask any questions and for the discussion, is want to kind of end on a couple of notes here, and again, being transparent with everybody who's watching here in the committee. Under Act 47, Section 711E requires the receiver to consult with the MFRAC committee prior to exercising certain powers under the law, including the power to file bankruptcy. That's enumerated at section 706A9. As I think this group knows, the receiver has received authorization from the Secretary of DCED to file a bankruptcy petition should he so desire. But the receiver also needs to bring this to the MFRAC committee as a duty to consult, which is what's being done right now. That is what we're doing here. We are using this meeting to consult with the MFRAC committee on the issue of filing for bankruptcy in compliance with section 711E. I want to be clear here, though, as well. The receiver has not filed for bankruptcy and right now is in the process of engaging in good faith negotiations with the relevant groups to try to avoid a bankruptcy filing. The desire here is still to try to avoid a bankruptcy filing and to engage in good faith negotiations towards that end, which is what we are doing and which is what we're setting up now. So we're not turning around and filing for bankruptcy tomorrow, later today. We want to engage in good faith negotiations to try to avoid a bankruptcy filing. And again, the purpose of today was to be able to put this in context so that people understand Chester's financial situation, the baseline projections, the options it really has for fiscal recovery, and the options that the receiver has. So with that, I appreciate the committee's patience as I went through that, and happy to answer any questions, or we're happy to sit back and allow the discussion to take place.
Mr. Kapoor, thank you again for today's presentation, opening it up to the full committee for any questions, comments, concerns.
Yeah, this is Andrew. Mr. Receiver, Mr. Kapoor, I do want to say I thought your presentation today was very clear and very thorough, which it certainly needs to be when you guys are discussing some of the measures that you're talking about here at this committee meeting. You in one of your slides, you had a bullet point that you're open to other options. I do want to say I don't have any other options that I could think of as we're looking at the situation and some of the numbers. I do hope there is a way with some of your current negotiations to potentially avoid bankruptcy. But if that's not the case, I do think that you guys have turned over every rock and would certainly not take this lightly. And again, have put together a pretty thorough and clear case to that end.
Thank you, Mr. Sheep. I just want to again thank DCED for their support over the last 2+ years, longer than that, for the city of Chester, but for me personally, for the time that I've been involved with this engagement. No sooner than we end here today at 3 o'clock, we have a public hearing to secure another $5 million loan for the city of Chester. So the steps taken, as you say, don't have any additional suggestions. I just want to point out that DCED has been very supportive and from a financial standpoint and from a think tank standpoint, if you will, and getting us to this point. So thank you, sir. Does anyone else on the committee have any questions of myself or comments in general or anything of Mr. Kapoor? All right, well, I'll just add a couple comments in closing from my end. As I mentioned, the DCED hearing, I just want to reiterate a point that Mr. Kapoor made earlier, that this is still fluid, so to speak. The order of magnitude is pretty much in place, but there are still details being figured out here. For example, I'll go on a somewhat of a granular level, but reinvesting in city services. The city currently does not have an IT department. Through this effort or through this plan of adjustment, would love to see at least 2 employees with that background and that focus to help advance the city from an efficiency standpoint. We don't want to continue to just throw labor or I should say man hours at a problem. There are smarter ways to work, but if we can't get over the hurdle of implementing some of those IT solutions, then we're stuck where we were. So this isn't all cuts. There are matters of reinvestment that we are looking at as well. Another point I wanted to make is absent from this discussion or from the modeling that's been presented to date is what is the resident impact? We can project the change in the earned income tax rate. However, we have not been able to project to date what a potential change in water rates may be as contemplating a monetization, even if it were to be kept in public hands. Other factors to consider: real estate taxes, mercantile. Mr. Kapoor, could you speak to that for a second? I want to say by and large, real estate taxes will be held flat through this model, but do you foresee any rate changes on that side of the equation?
So, Mr. Receiver, I mean, I think it all depends, right? And that's kind of how this happens. For every dollar you save in one area, you need another dollar in another area. And so, I mean, I think what you've seen through the history here is that residents have paid a pretty high price in the city. Their taxes are high. You've got the second highest earned income tax in the Commonwealth behind Philadelphia. You've got other fees. They pay water fees, stormwater fees. There's the stormwater authority fees as well that they're paying. Particularly for a community like this, a lot of it has fallen to them. You can also see it in terms of the services that are being provided. It's no disrespect to the current group of employees that the city has, but that the needs that Chester has right now are monumental, whether that's in terms of capital and other things. So, right now, what effectively has happened, I think, is a great deal of this has fallen to residents, under the baseline, the taxes remain where they are. But again, as part of these negotiations or part of these discussions, at the end of the day, what has to happen is recurring revenues have got to be able to meet recurring costs. You'll hear us say that over and over and over again. And at the end of the day, that is what is going to keep Chester, and that is what it's going to make Chester fiscally solvent. That's what it's going to allow it to invest where it needs to invest. It's employees and capital, and make it a place where our recurring revenues are meeting recurring costs, and where it is actually fixed for real, as opposed to something that will just kick the can down the road for 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 years and be back in the same situation, just with different people.
Appreciate that. And I guess just the most important point I want to make here at this point is that I really want to get that that level of information into the residents' hands. So more modeling to come to really explain what is the bottom line, what is the dollar impact to each household. I really want to be able to present that. If there is nothing else, we're going to wrap up here for today and reconvene on the 4th Tuesday of September. In closing, again, just opening it up. Does anyone have any comments? Well, hearing none, this meeting is adjourned.